raised awareness, but it hasn't stopped the global danger. Why will this time be different?
I think each time has also led to something. I think that we have taken a lot of steps forward, but we forgot to ban nuclear weapons. And this is sort of connected to also other movements on humanitarian law. We've developed humanitarian law, humanitarian disarmament. We banned all the other weapons of mass destruction. We banned landmines and chemical cluster munitions. This is sort of a progressive development. Today is Human Rights Day.
Right.
We've also have this new human rights treaties. This is a part of a bigger process where we no longer let the states dictate things and threaten individuals.
But what do you respond, Beatrice Finn, to those who say the Nobel Committee has yet again given a peace prize too early for something that hasn't happened yet? That a peace prize shouldn't be awarded for effort, but for result? We have a treaty. We achieved a treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons this year. And this award is not just for the future, it's also for what we have achieved. And the Nobel Committee recognized that very clearly. But it also gives us a huge momentum to take this treaty forward. Now with this prize, we have much more of a momentum to get states to join it. Well, Beatrice, some of our audience members here in Oslo also have a lot of questions they would like to ask you. And we're very honored to have among us today survivors of the atomic bombings of 1945, as well as the current mayors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I'll be joining them in just a moment. But first, James has been taking a look at the long road to a UN nuclear weapons ban treaty. Take a look.
In the grounds of United Nations headquarters, a statue showing a Georgian the Dragon, the vanquished beast made out of decommissioned nuclear missiles. The UN was founded in the same moment in history as the only actual use of nuclear weapons. In fact, President Harry Truman signed the charter of the organization on the same day that his forces dropped a bomb on the Japanese city of Nagasaki. Just 5 months later, the first meeting of the UN General Assembly. And its first resolution was about what it somewhat euphemistically called the problems raised by the discovery of atomic energy.
The report is adopted unanimously by 47 votes out of 47 voters.
More than 7 decades later, a new campaign to ban nuclear weapons was backed by a grassroots network of activists coordinated by ICANN. They made a significant breakthrough, a new treaty. In September, when the treaty was opened for signature, on the very first day, 50 nations signed it in this chamber. Now, that number of 50 is crucial. If 50 countries go on to take the next step and formally ratify it, in many countries that involves a parliamentary vote, then this will become international law. The 5 most powerful nations at the UN do not support the treaty. The permanent members of the Security Council see their right of veto and their nuclear weapons as key instruments of strategy. One nation that strongly supports the new treaty says they need to reconsider.
We believe that this argument is fundamentally flawed. We believe it's a kind of a dogma which will just be repeated and not really looked behind it. First of all, security. Security for whom? Security for states, for certain states? Is it the security of the people? Are the people of the United States or Russia more safe and secure with nuclear weapons? Or aren't, as we see it, the sheer existence of nuclear weapons a threat to their security?
There have been efforts at nuclear disarmament in the past. In the UN lobby, a picture of a meeting between US President John F. Kennedy in 1961 with the Russian Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko. The hope in the following year died when the world came close to nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Some see parallels to recent events.
I think it is just as dangerous as the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. I really do. I'm very much concerned because there is some talk about let's do something, let's cool down the temperature and let's get into dialogue. But the dialogue has essentially stopped already for a long time. There were various efforts over the years and over the decades, but in essence there hasn't been any dialogue for quite a number of years. And in the meantime, North Korea has stepped up their efforts to acquire nuclear weapons.
It's not just the prospect of war in North Korea and the US threatening to pull out of the Iran nuclear deal. There's also the prospect of a new arms race. President Trump has made it clear he wants to modernise his nuclear arsenal. Beatrice, your treaty became a reality at meetings this year at the United Nations. My day job is covering the UN, and work there is often very slow, laborious and doesn't get anywhere. Describe for us the atmosphere in New York this summer.
It was a really incredible moment with so many governments that were there and really wanted to achieve this treaty. And then, of course, also together with international organizations like the UN and the Red Cross, and of course civil society that had an active part in these negotiations. And together we really managed to get a really good treaty. A treaty that categorically prohibits nuclear weapons. And the joy that people felt that last day when the treaty was adopted, I mean, it was huge. You heard Setsuko speak today, talking about how she said that was the best of humanity that day. When we finally took that step, no longer are nuclear weapons supposed to be legal.
Well, tell us what happens now, because it takes 50 states to ratify it. How long do you think that's going to take to happen? And what states do you look to next to try and persuade, for example, maybe members of NATO?
Well, ICAN is a global campaign, and we do a lot of work in the UN, but this is really a national issue. This is where people in their own countries can make a difference. We now are going to focus on working on getting as many states to sign and to ratify. And it's work that's going to happen in capitals, with parliaments, with decision makers, and looking at the other treaties that prohibits weapons. Getting to 50 takes about 2 years. It's a bit of bureaucracy that you have to fight through. So it takes a bit of time, but we're hopeful that we will get this treaty ratified within 2 years.
Beatrice and James, I'm here now in our audience here at Oslo City Hall, and they have quite a few questions they would like to ask you. First up is Henrik Stenberg, who's a university student in global politics. Your question to Beatrice Finn. Please stand up.
Good afternoon. What do you think about Norway voting against the nuclear ban treaty in the UN this summer?
Norway voted against the treaty this summer, the only country, in fact, to have voted against it. Your reaction, Beatrice?
Well, Norway has been, we're actually back here where we started in 2013, where the Norwegian government launched a new initiative to look at the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. And Norway's always been a leader, a humanitarian superpower. But unfortunately, they are also aligning themselves very closely with the nuclear armed states. And I think this is really the key. Governments have to say, are we ready to use weapons of mass destruction on civilians, or are we not? Right. Are nuclear weapons acceptable weapons, or are they not? And the Norwegian government has a tough decision ahead of them. But I have all confidence in that the Norwegian people, we know that there's a lot of support with Norwegian people. We have amazing organizations in Norway that are working on this, and they will make Norway sign this treaty. Beatrice, as James mentioned, applause here from the audience in Oslo. They certainly are very enthusiastic about the treaty, but Beatrice, NATO is not convinced about this treaty. The Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, who's also the former Prime Minister of NATO, says it clearly disregards the current security challenges around the world. The French Foreign Minister has gone as far as saying that it is irresponsible because it weakens the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. There is already the NPT. There is a 1963 test ban treaty. Why was this additional treaty needed? Why this new treaty on nuclear weapons when there are already so many others out there? Well, look at the rhetoric between the United States and North Korea. They are doing that. The United States is a part of the NPT. It still threatens to use nuclear weapons. It still acts like it can use nuclear weapons. So the NPT doesn't yet prohibits that kind of activities. And that is what the treaty is doing. And NATO, of course, is a military alliance. And it's an alliance with countries that have nuclear weapons. But that does not mean that all states in NATO have to follow the same rules when it comes to weapons of mass destruction. NATO has many different policies within them on other weapons. So that should be possible with weapons, nuclear weapons as well. And of course, NATO has an outspoken goal. NATO has committed to a world free of nuclear weapons. They are going to work for a world free of nuclear weapons. So I'm expecting NATO states to do that right now and to see how one day NATO is going to be a nuclear weapon-free alliance. And we have to now look at how we're going to make that happen. And this treaty is a way forward for that.
Beatrice, I'm now going to play devil's advocate, and some in the room might say that's an appropriate phrase as I put to you some of the arguments in favour of nuclear weapons. And I think it was the British wartime leader Winston Churchill who was one of the first to pursue this argument. He said it was the sublime irony. And the argument's this, that nuclear stalemate, the risk of mass annihilation, is actually what's kept the world more secure in the last 70 years. What do you say to that?
I don't agree with that. First, we've seen huge consequences throughout the nuclear testing. We have survivors here from nuclear test areas who can tell you what they have suffered because of these weapons tests. But also, we've been so close to catastrophe throughout the Cold War. And now, decades after, when documents are being declassified, we're finding out more and more about accidents, near misses, and irrational precedents. And just look at today. I mean, we also had a war in Iraq that was fueled by threats of weapons of mass destruction. We have conflict with Iran. We've had Kashmir, North Korea right now. Look at the situation between North Korea and the United States. This does not feel safe. This does not feel like peace or stability. Rather, nuclear weapons are fueling these conflicts and making the threat of war much more likely.
But let's use the case of North Korea, because we know some of these states got their nuclear weapons through secret means. What happens if everyone gives up their nuclear weapons and yet someone doesn't, and they retain this capability? Who then is there to take them on? How do you police your new nuclear-free world?
Well, there's a huge amount of verification programs. We see right now with the Iran deal, for example, a very strict verification programs that will be able to control. I don't think that is going to be the problem. The problem is going to get countries to want to disarm. When we can get countries to want to disarm, we are going to fix the technical side of this. But right now we have a situation where a country like the United States or UK or France or China and Russia have spent the last 70 years arguing that nuclear weapons equal security. And of course, a vulnerable, weak state like North Korea is going to listen to that and want the same. We have given these weapons power. We see them as powerful. But when we stop doing that, we can also get disarmament.
All right, Beatrice, another question here from one of our audience members, Akari Surumaki, who's a university student at UWC Nordic. Your question. Stand up, please.
Thank you. My question is, what do you think about the criticism that nuclear ban treaty is too idealistic?
You've heard this one before, I'm sure. The treaty is too idealistic. It doesn't take into account the realities of the current security environment of the world.
Well, I think that the treaty is, first of all, it is realistic because it exists. It is here. But also, it actually takes reality into consideration. It doesn't focus on abstract theories and our perception of what we hope nuclear weapons will achieve. But it looks at facts. What happens when nuclear weapons are used? And many of you heard Setsuko Thurlov talk about today. What happens when nuclear weapons are used? That is the reality. There is no preparedness to deal with the consequences. There are no national or international relief agencies that will be able to provide adequate help to survivors. The only solution is to prevent this from happening. And as long as they exist, it will happen one day.
Well, we put out a call out on Twitter earlier asking people what they thought of this treaty, Beatrice, asking them if they thought the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons project treaty is realistic. And I want to give you just the results of that poll. Now, 37% of the people who responded say, yes, it is possible. 58% say no, it is too idealistic, and 5% think otherwise. And an interesting question here from one of the people on social media, on Twitter, the user @AnotherMind, who says they can't be abolished. Who do you expect to be the enforcer? Well, that's a legitimate question and an important one. Through what mechanism is a treaty enforced? What organization steps in to enforce it?
Well, first of all, it is realistic because we have prohibited other weapons and gotten rid of other weapons, chemical weapons, biological weapons, landmines and cluster munitions. We are moving to a world where indiscriminate weapons that violates the laws of war are no longer acceptable military policies. And of course, it's going to require a lot of inspection. We have the IAEA, for example, who has detected problems in the past. And all of these details are going to be solved when the nuclear armed states are joining this treaty.
You talk about cluster munitions, you talk about biological weapons, you talk about chemical weapons. That's an interesting one right now. We have Syria's chemical weapons. The measures there to stop their use and punish their use have failed completely. Do you think that affects the global efforts to fight weapons of mass destruction?
No, I don't think so, because I think that what would the alternative be? Would we have less chemical weapons use if we kept them legal? If we didn't have a treaty? If we didn't have efforts to eliminate them? Then all states would have had them. If we kept that as an acceptable means of warfare, using gas on people, if that was acceptable, we wouldn't have less chemical weapons used today. So the treaty, it doesn't, of course, it doesn't mean that we will never ever see violations of these norms, but it sets a very strong norm and also helps the international community to respond in that case. There's been huge condemnation of Syria and a lot of pressure on them.
Well, later in the programme, we'll be looking at the one moment in history when nuclear weapons have been used in 1945. Then, of course, there was one nuclear power, the US. Now the situation is very different. Folly's been looking at some very worrying numbers.
9 countries together possess around 15,000 nuclear weapons, and there are signs that some are modernizing and modifying their arsenals to improve their capabilities. Russia and the US lead the pack and to this day possess the bulk of the world's warheads. Both sides spent billions during the Cold War to beef up their arsenals. And over the years, several other countries also joined the nuclear club. Today, the UK has a total stockpile of 215 warheads and maintains a fleet of 4 nuclear submarines, each carrying 16 Trident missiles. France also seems to favor the sub. It has 300 warheads and most are deployed on submarines equipped with M45 and M51 missiles. Israel neither confirms nor denies the existence of its nuclear weapons stockpile, but it's estimated to have around 80 warheads and has the capability to build more. Pakistan isn't quite so shy about its nuclear ambitions, a healthy stockpile of around 140 warheads, and it's working to improve its arsenal. The reason for that, of course, is neighboring India, home to an estimated 130 warheads. It's also increasing its stockpile and enhancing delivery methods. China has 270 warheads it can deliver by air, land and sea. Then there's the very secretive North Korea. Just how advanced their nuclear program is remains unclear. They claim to have a new type of intercontinental ballistic missile that can hit the US mainland. Experts think they have enough material for around 10 plutonium-based warheads, but there's also believed to be producing highly enriched uranium. If that's true, by 2020, they could have between 20 to 100 warheads. The United States, which is increasingly concerned about North Korea's nuclear program, has the second largest stockpile in the world, with 6,800 warheads in total. 2,800 of them are retired. They're still intact. They're just waiting to be dismantled. And to this day, the US is the only country to have used nuclear weapons in war. But in terms of pure numbers, Russia remains the biggest nuclear power in the world, with 7,000 warheads and just over 2,500 retired. But according to ICANN, it's also in modernization mode. Perhaps what is the most chilling is that many of today's nuclear weapons are much more powerful than the ones dropped on Japan in 1945. A single nuclear warhead, if dropped on a large city, could kill millions.
Some sobering statistics. Perhaps your treaty brings a little optimism, but let's look at what's going on in the world. And you have North Korea, which is firing missiles, testing its nuclear capabilities. You have a war of words between North Korea and the US. And then you have Iran and President Trump threatening to torpedo the Iran nuclear deal. Look at this moment in history. How dangerous is it right now? Very dangerous. I think we're, just as the Cuban Missile Crisis, really close to a nuclear disaster. And of course, as these threats are increasing, their militaries are also getting prepared, being responsive to these kind of threats, which also increases the risk of an accident. The risk is always above zero, which means that if we keep nuclear weapons forever, they will be used.
Okay. Now, ICANN, Beatrice Finn, you are the executive director, but ICANN brings together 468 organizations in over 100 countries. And Tim Wright here is ICANN's Asia Pacific director. Please stand up, Tim. I want to ask you a few questions about your region, specifically North Korea. This is a question that's coming up a lot with the viewers who want to know about North Korea's nuclear capabilities right now. They claim to have an intercontinental ballistic missile that's capable of reaching the mainland U.S. They have been prone to exaggeration in the past, but just how dangerous a moment is this? What are North Korea's real nuclear capabilities today?
It's an incredibly dangerous situation. It's very easy to see how it could spiral out of control, and the consequences would be absolutely catastrophic. But we shouldn't just be talking about North Korea's nuclear arsenal. We also need to be talking about the United States nuclear arsenal, the close to 7,000 nuclear weapons, and this has been the problem for so long. We've focused on stopping the spread of nuclear weapons without addressing the thousands that already exist.
And we have an interesting comment from one of our Twitter viewers right now, Alex Lalex, who asks, why is everyone so focused on North Korea? Donald Trump is much more unstable, he says, and has 7,000 nukes, while North Korea has less than 10. Who's more dangerous today, Donald Trump or Kim Jong-un?
I think the weapons are very dangerous, and there's no difference between.
But when you have a leader who's unstable and irrational, as some would say, that makes it even more dangerous, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And that's why we want all countries of the world to declare very clearly that they oppose these weapons. And for countries in Europe, in NATO, to say that these weapons are essential for their security is sending a terrible message to North Korea. And do the people of Europe who are supposedly protected by US nuclear weapons really feel safe knowing that President Trump has his finger on the trigger? I don't think so. I think this is a time for action and for people to really rethink what these weapons are, what they do, and to join the great majority of the world's nations in rejecting them and signing the treaty.
Okay, thank you very much, Tim Wright, for that.
Beatrice Finn, when you gave your acceptance speech at the podium behind me, I was listening very carefully. You talked about leaders with a bruised ego. You talked about one impulsive tantrum away. You were referring to President Trump, weren't you? Tell us what you think about the current President of the United States, the man in charge of the nuclear football, the man with the launch codes, and his temperament.
I think it's a very dangerous situation. I think the more world leaders actively threaten with nuclear weapons, the more you also undermine this kind of norm that we had so far that, oh, you're not supposed to go there. And it just really increases the risk of them being used. You also see that coupled with huge investments in modernization programs, a new nuclear posture review that is rolling back on other steps and going in the wrong direction, developing new types of nuclear weapons, small, usable nuclear weapons. In addition, of course, also openly mocking diplomacy as an alternative. And that is one of the most dangerous things, I think, to see negotiated agreements, solutions to problems, peaceful solutions as something negative, and that bombing, killing civilians would be better, stronger. It's absurd.
You would have been critical, I think, of any US president and their nuclear strategy. But Donald Trump is different. And just days before you got the news that ICANN was going to get the Nobel Peace Prize, you were on Twitter referring, I think, to comments attributed to the US Secretary of State. You tweeted, "Donald Trump is a moron." Can he be trusted?
To think that you can use nuclear weapons is moronic. To rely on nuclear weapons and think that that provides you security is moronic. These weapons are threats. They are not keeping us safe. They are keeping us unsafe.
Okay. Beatrice, another question from our audience here in Oslo. And this is Lena Keller, who's a master's student at the University of Oslo. Please stand up and ask your question to Beatrice.
Thank you. The Nobel Foundation has recently admitted that in the past it made investments in companies that produce nuclear weapons. What was your first reaction when you learned about this? And did you ever consider not accepting the award?
A very good question.
Divestment of nuclear weapons production is a really big campaign issue for us. And I think that that's also one of the things we're hoping that this treaty will achieve. by prohibiting assistance to production of nuclear weapons, we can tell banks and pension funds and other financial institutions to stop investing in the production of nuclear weapons. We have had great conversations with the Nobel Foundations. I'm going to meet them in Stockholm soon.
Right.
And they have assured us that they have a policy, and they have said that there are apparently some gaps in their policy, but they have assured us that they will work together with us and our colleagues in PAX that do the Don't Bank on the Bomb report on making sure that that is tight, that it's watertight investments, that there will be no money from the Nobel Foundation invested in nuclear weapons production.
Beatrice, but doesn't it all come down to the fact that war is lucrative? The weapons industry is lucrative. Banks invested some $500 billion in nuclear weapons between 2013 and 2016. Alfred Nobel, who created this Peace Prize, made his fortune from weapons and explosives. How pragmatic are you about this? And how do you make nuclear disarmament bankable?
Through the treaty, because we have seen from other treaties that when a weapon is prohibited, it becomes bad business. Investors stop putting money into cluster munitions production, for example, because the majority of the states in the world has prohibited it. It's no longer sound investment strategy to invest all this money in building a weapon that is going out of fashion, that is being prohibited. So we're hoping for similar things with nuclear weapons. And that is something where we, like normal people, can impact a lot. We can look at our banks, and through the Don't Bank on the Bomb report, you can see if your bank or pension fund invests in nuclear weapons, and then ask them to stop that or change bank.
That all works, but I'm going to bring up President Trump again. He says he wants to modernize the US nuclear arsenal. There could be another arms race.
Absolutely. It's extremely dangerous, and we need to stop it.
One region where there is a lot of conflict, it's rife, is the Middle East. And there you have Israel, which has a nuclear weapons program, although it doesn't like to talk about it very much. You have Iran, that has nuclear know-how, currently governed by a treaty. You have Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, who are talking about nuclear power, not about nuclear weapons. But are you worried about an arms race in that most sensitive of regions?
I think there's a lot of concerns. And as long as we keep accepting that nuclear weapons are good for security, there's always going to be others that want them. And then you're going to have all of these regional dynamics that play into this issue, where new conflicts and accidents and misunderstandings can very easily happen. So it's definitely very urgent that we make a strong, clear rejection through this treaty that this is not a weapon that we accept in the international community.
One of your problems, though, is states that are under the nuclear umbrella, states that are good friends of the US, for example, that will have a fair bit of pressure put on them not to sign this treaty. Where are the states you look at next to try and have a bit of a breakthrough? Because you've got on board the states in the EU that aren't NATO members. Where do you look next?
I think we are going to work very actively in NATO states, in all of them, and also in the nuclear armed states, to create political space for change. Just a few days ago, for example, the majority of the Norwegian parliament said that they wanted to pursue a research, an examination of how Norway, what implications it would have for Norway to join this treaty. I think that's really a good start, to start looking at these things. Countries might claim, or leaders might claim, that they are not ready right now, but I think that these countries, if they are true to humanitarian values and the laws of war, as they say they are, they should be able to reject nuclear weapons.
All right, Beatrice, we've talked about the politics. Now let's talk about the human side, the human aspect. And with me now is Abaka Anjane Madison, who's a former senator from the Marshall Islands, which were the site, as you know, of multiple nuclear tests by the U.S. in the late 40s and 50s, the most devastating one on Bikini Atoll in 1954. Please stand up. I'd like to ask you a question, and I think our audience here want to know your experience, your story, and the impacts nuclear tests have had on your livelihoods. Because very often when we talk about the impact of nuclear weapons, we think of the victims of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But you and your community has also been affected by the nuclear tests conducted by the U.S. Tell us how affected you've been and the impact it's had on your livelihoods.
The people of Rongelap were directly affected by the hydrogen bomb that exploded in 1954, 1,000 times greater than Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings. The bomb has poisoned our land and forced our people to live in exile. And it also caused so many lives of our loved ones and many families to suffer even today.
But you have received reparations from the U.S.
It was inadequate, very inadequate. No one can expect and put a number, amount of money on a life. And so, and the damage that is, been lingering, it's far greater than what was estimated.
Okay, so what are you expecting out of this treaty then?
First of all, is justice, and that, human life is more important. And everyone deserves to live in peace and, with their human rights.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Abaka and Jane Madison, a former senator from the Marshall Islands, here with us in Oslo today. Thanks.
Now, we want to take a further moment to explore the human cost of nuclear weapons. It was the end of the Second World War. Hiroshi Harada was just 6 years old when the US dropped an atomic bomb on his city of Hiroshima. This is his own story in his own words.
My name is Hiroshi Harada, former director of Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum. The dome was originally called Hiroshima Prefectural Industrial Promotion Hall. It was used for showcasing Hiroshima's products and promoting cultural activities. It was in a bustling downtown district. My parents took me there often when I was small. I was at Hiroshima Station, about 2 kilometers from the hypocenter. Standing behind the station building, I saw the flash of light. My father lay down on his stomach and covered me. I was saved miraculously. The city was obliterated in a second. So many buildings that once stood destroyed. The view of Hiroshima defied any explanation of what actually happened. The building was right below the hypocenter, but somehow withstood the blast from above. Back then, many people could not accept the idea of preserving the dome, which would bring back the memories. But others felt a sense of crisis. Without a building like this, there wouldn't be anything to hand down to the next generation. And that would mean losing the experience both from our sight and memory. The building in its original form can tell the account of humanity's first experience of atomic bomb and its devastation. And by seeing it, it warns us to never repeat it again. It's been constantly exposed to wind and rain. Deterioration is progressing rapidly. We have to reinforce the structure as needed, continuously survey the building and repeat this process. It is most important to have something you can see with your own eyes, to pass on the experience of atomic bomb to the next generation. Whenever you see the building, your heart will be reminded of the catastrophe. This is why I'm glad to have preserved the building. The dome survived the devastation, saw with its own eyes what happened at the hypocenter in that very moment, and continues to welcome many people in the same place today. I want to say thank you for doing everything you've done so far, and I hope you will continue to be well forever so that you can spread your message.
A first-hand account of unimaginable horror, Beatrice, 72 years ago. 2 bombs used in Japan. Contrast that for us with the global arsenal now.
I mean, many of the nuclear weapons today are much, much bigger, would have much more of an impact. And cities look different today, much more densely populated. If you detonate one of those, one of the bigger nuclear weapons that we have in our arsenals over a densely populated area, millions of people could die.
James, Beatrice, I would now like to introduce to our viewers around the world 2 survivors of the atomic bombings, 2 hibakushas as they're known, from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Teruni Tanaka and Toshiki Fujimori. Thank you so much for being with us here today. They will be speaking to us through their translator. Thank you so much, Tanaka-san. You are the last generation of survivors. Do you worry that in a few years we will forget about Hiroshima and Nagasaki? How do you ensure that the legacy lives on?
今の核兵器は広島長崎型の核兵器と規模が全然違います。で、そういうものは絶対使っていけないということをきちんと伝えていかなくちゃいけないと思っています。
First of all, the nuclear weapons which exist today are of a completely different scale, a completely different size and level to those that were used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We must never allow us to forget what happened and never allow them to be used again.
What do you remember of that fateful day of August 9th, 1945, when the bomb hit your city, Nagasaki? You were just, what, 12 years old? I know it's very painful to relive that day, that moment, but if you could share with us your experience, what do you remember about that day?
原爆投下は予告なしに起こりました。爆撃機で突然爆発させたので、瞬間的に身の回りが真っ白になりました。それが爆発の瞬間です。
The nuclear bomb was dropped on Nagasaki with absolutely no warning. We had no idea that it was coming, and all of a sudden this one bomb was dropped from one plane, and it just turned into a huge bright light which just immensely covered everything.
Fujimori-san, you were in Hiroshima. Tell us about your experience, and also why was it important for you to be here today? What is your message to the world?
私が被爆したのは1歳4ヶ月の時ですので、私自身には記憶はないんですが、毎年8月6日になると母親が子供を集めて自分の体験を話聞かせてくれました。そのことが私の頭にはたくさん残っています。
I myself was only 1 year and 4 months old at the time that the bomb was dropped in Hiroshima. So my own direct memory of what happened then is not strong. However, every year on the anniversary on August 6th, my mother would gather me and all of the children together and tell us of what happened, the story of that day.
Fujimori-san, Tanaka-san, thank you so much for sharing your experience with us. Thank you. A round of applause for our two survivors of the atomic bombings who are here with us in Oslo today. Thank you so very much. Thank you.
Beatrice Finn, really humbling listening to that. Do you worry as these events, as they inevitably will do, pass beyond living memory, that the world will not be able to connect with this horror in the same way?
Yeah, I think it is a real concern, and I think that we owe it to survivors to heed to their call right now. Many people have ignored their stories for a very long time, and we have one final chance to prohibit and eliminate nuclear weapons before they are gone, in a way. And I think that we really need to make sure that they get to watch that. And I know that many survivors were extremely happy to see the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. But we can do more, and we must do more.
And so you're trying to persuade all these different UN nation states. But aren't we potentially not just talking about nation states? Aren't we talking about armed groups like ISIL or Al-Qaeda? Aren't we talking about madmen? Aren't we talking about cults? How do you deal with all the sort of people who could get this technology which has been invented? It can't be uninvented.
Well, you have to first get rid of the ones that exist, because they are all threats, not just for the states themselves to use them or accident, but also a threat of terrorist attacks on the nuclear weapons facilities and for theft. And there's been a lot of research done on all the accidents and incidents around the US nuclear weapons facilities, but we have no idea what's going on in other countries that don't have the same kind of transparency. It's quite scary to think about all these countries that have nuclear weapons and worry about who's protecting them, what kind of safety measures do they have. So we have to eliminate these weapons and then work to make sure that there is no access to any kind of non-state groups to this material.
Beatrice, before I bring in our next audience member, I have a question for you about, the different countries that we've mentioned. We've talked about North Korea, but we've talked about the US and all these other countries that have nuclear weapons. What do you do with a country like Israel that is not officially a nuclear power?
Well, I think it's not a very well-kept secret. But we have campaigners also in Israel, and they're doing a great job in trying to also increase transparency this is a democratic issue, and the people of the country need to know what the state is doing on their behalf. If the state is threatening to mass murder civilians, people should know about it. So they're doing a great job in trying to raise awareness about the nuclear weapons and trying to go to court to make sure that it's now legal to talk about it and things like that. So we're seeing some progress there.
But on that particular issue, you mentioned democratic states and so on. The argument can be made that the treaty would only work in a country where there's a vibrant civil society, where there are solid democratic institutions, where the governments are held accountable. What do you respond to that? I mean, would such a treaty and this movement that you're trying to garner from the civil society work in a country like Russia or North Korea?
Absolutely. I think that no state is isolated from international law and international norms. I mean, some of them might be quicker to pick it up, of course, but I think that each state still has to relate to it. And I think we see that with information warfare. The reason why they're trying to distort reality is because even the worst human rights violators know that it's not really acceptable to do that in public. So I think that these norms and pressure on state works, even in non-democratic countries.
Okay. I'm going to bring in now our next audience member. This is Margot Stoppels, who's a student at Oslo International School. Your question to ICANN.
ICANN has achieved so many different things, so many important things in 10 years. So what lessons does this provide to young people who want to change the world for the better?
A very good question. Your message to the youth, to the future generation?
To get involved, get engaged. I think that this prize is not just about nuclear weapons, but also about the power of civil society, the power of organizing. Today, I think we see many people feel disempowered and that their voice isn't being heard. We see governments going in the wrong direction towards nationalism and undermining international law. But people can make a difference. And I think that by engaging in civil society and through ICANN, for example, you can go to nuclearban.org and find out how to get involved. Together we are much stronger and we can change things.
I'm going to come back to President Trump again. He's pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal. He's signalled that he's coming out of the Paris climate deal. He's questioning the Iran nuclear deal. And you're starting a new international treaty. It seems that he, at least, and maybe some of the rest of the world, is going against the grain of multilateral diplomacy.
Well, this is the moment where we have to strengthen multilateral diplomacy. I think we're seeing a coordinated attack, but from many on international institutions, on law, on humanitarian values, and we can't just give up. Those that still are committed to international law, to human rights, to humanitarian law, and to international multilateral institutions have to fight harder. This is where we strengthen it. This is where we buckle down and say, no, we have to resist. And I think that the Paris Agreement, for example, is a great example where the rest of the world said, no, we are still going to keep this. And cities in the United States and the American people said, no, you can pull out, but we are going to keep, this is a norm now. This is something that we are supporting. And I think that this could be the same thing with nuclear weapons. It is not just the presidents that make these decisions. We make these decisions.
So your campaign, as we know, is about the people, not necessarily the political class. But in the political class, in the key states, the nuclear states, you do have one interesting thing, which is that in one of those states, one of the permanent members of the Security Council, for the first time you have a politician waiting in the wings who's an anti-nuclear campaigner. Do you have high hopes for the leader of the opposition in the UK, Jeremy Corbyn?
I don't think it is an accident that there's a UK politician that is supportive of this kind of work, because the UK people, the British people, have a very long tradition of being anti-nuclear weapons. And you have a huge support for this in parts of the UK, like Scotland, for example. So I think that is just a reflection of the UK society. And it's a great encouragement. And I think that everyone who wants their country to support this kind of work, to support nuclear disarmament, to join this treaty, need to elect politicians that support that.
Beatrice, a question here from a viewer on Facebook. Lots of questions on social media. Bubak, who says nuclear weapons can't be abolished when the U.S. continues to threaten small countries. Those countries are developing nuclear weapons to protect themselves against that threat. So my question, he says to you, Will the US government ever agree to abolish nuclear weapons? How hopeful are you about that?
Of course I think that they can. They built them, they can take them apart. As long as we think that these weapons are great weapons and provide security, there are all the incentives for having them. And you're promoting those incentives to other countries as well. But when we reshape how we see these, when we see them as giant dirty bombs that cause chaos and havoc and just an awful humanitarian situation, they are not going to be attractive. And it's going to be much easier for politicians to make decisions to cut budgets, cut numbers, to not renew different programs. That is how we want to work. We want to make it much more easy for these states to take those decisions.
Another question on Facebook from Aka Fele. If the US and UK consider nuclear weapons to be a tool of security, Aka says, would they give up theirs? Same question as before, which you've answered. But I do want to ask you about the use of nuclear power for civilian purposes. Can you divorce the two? We have an energy crisis looming. What about the use of civilian nuclear power for civilian purposes?
Well, they are two different things. I mean, one of them is an energy source, and one of them is a weapon meant to kill civilians. So I think that there might be similarities in technology, but today with modern verification measures, that is possible to verify that it's just used for energy purposes. So I think we have to separate these things because one of them is supposed to be an energy source and one of them is a weapon of mass destruction that is meant to kill people, and that needs to be illegal.
Beatrice, you and the members of your campaign, your campaigners, you've been working very, very hard, but you're normal human beings too. Fathers and mothers, I know you're the mother of young children. I want you to be honest and realistic with me. Do you think there will be a world free of nuclear weapons in their lifetime?
Yes, absolutely. I think change can happen really fast once it starts. And we have seen the world take huge steps forwards before. We have made so much progress on big social issues, justice issues, women's right to vote, civil rights, end of apartheid, gay marriage, things that people said is impossible, it's never going to happen, and oh, you're being naive. And then it happens, and it just opens the gates, and it changes very, very quickly.
Surely you have some doubts, though. You're being very optimistic.
That's what we are. You have to be.
But you know the other alternative. You mentioned it there on the podium. In your speech, you mentioned the alternative facing the world.
I refuse to wait for nuclear weapons to be used. So all of our campaigners refuse to accept that as an inevitable fact.
Beatrice Finn, thank you so much, the Executive Director of ICANN, for talking to us. Folly.
Thank you so much, Beatrice. And thank you to the survivors who shared their experience with us, to our audience here in Oslo City Hall, and to all of you who connected with us on social media. Thank you so much. This has been an Al Jazeera special live from Oslo. Thank you for watching. Bye for now.